Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the American Journal of International Law, The Law and Politics of Nuclear Weapons. My name is Jen Malott from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. You have all joined in listen-only mode. Please submit any questions via the Q&A box, and the panelists will review them if there is time. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we will restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. To get everything started, I'll turn things over to Monica Hakimi, one of the editors-in-chief of AJIL, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. By way of introduction, I'll just say that the law and politics of nuclear weapons appear to be, as with so much in the world right now, changing rather dramatically. So Iran's enhanced nuclear capabilities, escalating hostilities in the Middle East, developments on the Korean Peninsula, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, threats by various countries, including potentially the United States, to resume nuclear testing, and many other factors have led some experts to argue that the threat of nuclear war today is greater than it has been at any time since World War II. And I'm joined today by three extraordinary experts to discuss the global security architecture for nuclear weapons, if and why the risk of nuclear conflict has actually increased, and if so, what might be done in response. So to introduce them briefly before we embark on our conversation, Anna Hood is of the University of Auckland Waipapa Tamatu Rao Faculty of Law. Ankit Panda, Stanton Senior Fellow of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Nina Tannenwald, a senior lecturer with the Department of Political Science at Brown University. So thank you all for being here. And Anna, perhaps we could just start with you, and you could lay out for us the key elements and distinguishing features of the current international legal system for the regulation of nuclear weapons, so we have a little bit of a background against which to understand what might be happening moving forward.
Sure, and before I dive into that, thank you so much for hosting the webinar, to AJIL for organising it. I think it's a really important time for us to be talking about engaging with this topic, so it's wonderful to have a chance to be here. Trying to distill the international legal architecture for nuclear weapons briefly is no small task, because I think it's probably easiest to think about it as a web of lots of different legal mechanisms. We've got multilateral treaties, bilateral treaties, Security Council resolutions, decisions and advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice. So lots of different forms of law covering many different substantive areas of nuclear regulation. So we have laws about non-proliferation, disarmament, nuclear testing, nuclear weapon-free zones, nuclear threats. The list sort of goes on. And I think a web is a useful analogy, partly because there are so many different aspects to it, and partly because webs often have holes and gaps. And I think there are quite a few holes, gaps, tensions, ambiguities in the international legal architecture. And that's something perhaps we can come back to as we get further into the conversation. But perhaps the only other thing to say at this point is one of the key treaties at the heart of the web is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's probably known to many of the people tuning in and watching it today, but very briefly, this is a treaty that was created in 1968, and it has three key pillars. The first pillar is the non-proliferation pillar. And what that says is that it acknowledges that in 1968 there were 5 states, the P5, that had already manufactured and exploded nuclear weapons. So it acknowledges that they have weapons, but sets out to ensure that nuclear weapons don't spread to any other states parties to the NPT. We've then got the disarmament pillar, which talks about this idea that all states parties to the NPT have an obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith for effective measures on nuclear disarmament. And then finally, the third pillar isn't so directly about nuclear weapons, it's about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and ensuring that all states, whether they have weapons or not, are able to pursue nuclear energy for peaceful ends. So that's a very high-level overview, but hopefully gives us a little bit of a sense of what's broadly out there, and we can dive into different parts as we keep going.
And then Anna, maybe just one follow-up question. Could I also ask you to explain a little bit about the treaty on the testing of nuclear weapons, since I understand that's a different treaty arrangement, but is the prohibition on the testing of nuclear weapons is in itself also an element of this web of this regime, let's just say, on nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of treaties that focus on testing. Initially, the first treaty we got back in 1963 was the Partial Test Ban Treaty, or Limited Test Ban Treaty, which set in place prohibitions on testing weapons in the atmosphere, undersea, but not underground. And so we had some limits there. And then there was a long process of working towards what's going on as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which we got in the early 1990s, which does prohibit testing far more broadly, far more comprehensively, as the name suggests. That treaty hasn't yet entered into force. So the way that it works is that in Annex 2 of the treaty, it lists 44 countries, I think, from memory, that must sign and ratify the treaty before it enters into force. And at the moment, we've got a significant number of those Annex 2 states have ratified, but we've got a few outstanding ones that have not. And so at this point in time, it hasn't entered into force. I think, though, and perhaps something that would be useful to get into at some point, it has had a very strong normative force. So although we don't have it locked down in hard law, the vast majority of states have respected it since the early 1990s.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that just like overview. And so Ankit, I could perhaps turn to you and ask for another kind of overview, which is if you take these four dimensions of the nuclear regime, of course, there are also others, but non-proliferation, disarmament, peaceful use for nuclear of nuclear energy, and restrictions on testing. Which of these, if any, would you say is under stress right now? And what are the sources of stress?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a terrific place to take the conversation. And Monica, also thank you for inviting me. I'm a bit of the odd one out on the panel because I don't actually have expertise on the legal side or the normative side. My work focuses more on the security aspects of nuclear weapons, but that's perhaps where I can begin, right? So generally speaking, I think Anna did a great job of explaining the origins of the legal order, which really I would say cemented in a big way after the end of the Cold War, right? The indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995, the arrival at a comprehensive nuclear test ban. These were products of a moment after the end of the Cold War when I think the recession of nuclear weapons in international politics was very much palpable. And today, I think to generally answer your question about the sources of stress across all of those components, perhaps with the exception of peaceful energy, nuclear weapons are increasing in salience in national strategies of the countries that possess these weapons, that rely on them for their security, and the countries around the world that depend on extended deterrence assurances from the United States. These are 34 countries around the world, all in their own ways, capable actors, many of them prominent geopolitical players in various parts of the world. And so we stand now at the cusp of what many scholars are calling a third nuclear age, which is putting to test these institutions that we've put in place and strengthened after the Cold War period. So some of the factors to, I think, really underscore here are the intensification of rivalries among the great powers, the United States, China, and Russia being the three primary drivers of this dynamic. Each of these are nuclear possessor countries. Each of them have nuclear weapons capabilities that are significant. China is notable for abandoning in recent years its longstanding reliance on minimum deterrence and moving towards a much larger nuclear capability, bringing it closer to a peer of the United States and Russia, although not exactly at the same level. At the same time, regional dynamics are also festering. And here I think we have to talk about the United States system of extended deterrence. As part of the United States' own approach to nonproliferation, as part of its own grand strategy during the Cold War, the United States decided that it would be better if Washington could convince many of its allies that they wouldn't need nuclear weapons because US nuclear weapons could fill that role for their own security interests. And this is now coming under doubt. We're having this webinar just a few days after a US election that is going to return Donald Trump to the White House. President Trump and many in his orbit, I think, represent the emergence of a new school of grand strategic thought in the United States, frankly, that does not place either non-proliferation or alliances at the center of how the United States views the world. And this is applying a new source of stress on this normative regime, which is the stress of proliferation, not by those countries that we once considered to be so-called rogues, the North Koreas of the world, potentially the Irans of the world, but now potentially the South Koreas, the Japans, the Germanys, the Polands, the Turkeys, the Saudi Arabias. There's a long list of countries broadly in the American orbit that now might be more inclined to view nuclear weapons as useful. And then finally, disarmament. So as I identified, because nuclear weapons are growing in salience, the assumption that existed in the 1990s when the Cold War ended, when the United States and Russia unilaterally withdrew their non-strategic nuclear weapons that have been deployed outside of their territory. Today, the expectation is very different. Nuclear weapon states are sustaining and acquiring programs and capabilities that will really see the system of nuclear deterrence on which they rely sustained through the end of this century. And this is, again, introducing a new source of stress that I think is manifesting in a variety of ways in the international system. We haven't yet discussed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but this is one, I think, reaction to this trend that is going to see nuclear weapons largely remain salient throughout the rest of this century. So that's where we stand today in the 2020s, where, I do think we are at the cusp of this new nuclear age that has essentially applied multiple sources of stress to these pillars that we've built up.
Okay, thank you. And so let me just ask you one follow-up question, which is, what do you think explains the period of relaxation, let's just call it, or consensus, soft consensus before the turn to this new, what you're calling the new nuclear range? Like, why was it that there was this stabilization in the 90s and this expectation that maybe we could move in a more nuclear restricting direction?
Yeah, so I think, really just stated plainly, I think it was the end of the Cold War. You literally had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, when that word Armageddon really, I think, was emblematic of what a full-scale nuclear exchange would represent for humanity. And after the Cold War ended, you had the unilateral presidential nuclear initiatives, whereby the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that it was far too risky to keep nuclear weapons outside of their territory, so they repatriated these weapons. The United States, of course, through the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, helped reduce and repatriate nuclear weapons of the erstwhile Soviet Union to the newly created Russian Federation, securing those weapons. Because the geopolitical competition that defined the Cold War had evaporated, nuclear war was not the primary concern. And so the agenda shifted, right? It's not to say that nuclear weapons disappeared from international politics, but we did ultimately move away from these highfalutin concerns about nuclear deterrence and strategy between two superpowers to questions about proliferation in Southern Asia, proliferation on the Korean Peninsula by North Korea. But these were seen as challenges substantially of a different genre than the overwhelming nuclear anxieties that really characterized the Cold War. And this was also, of course, the period of the United States entering this period of unipolarity, where the U.S. was self-interested in promoting the development of this normative architecture around nuclear weapons. Those assumptions no longer hold.
Okay, great. That's super helpful. Thank you. Just to get it all on the table. And so, Nina, let's maybe talk about two of the specific instances that Ankit just mentioned. So the first being the failure of the Iran nuclear deal, the dissolution of the Iran nuclear deal, and the significance of that for the turn to this new nuclear age. And the second being, I would say, maybe an exhaustion with efforts to address the problems on the Korean Peninsula, and a sort of a reduction in the attention given to that particular arena for proliferation. And so how significant do you think these two sort of arenas for the proliferation of nuclear weapons have been in accelerating some of these trends or exacerbating some of these trends that Ankit mentioned?
So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. So let me start with the Iran agreement. So the short answer here is that the abandonment of the Iran agreement is a huge tragedy. But let me back up a little bit. So this is this is what we call the Iran deal, was formerly called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and it was negotiated in 2015. Many people think it was between the United States and Iran, but it was actually a multilateral agreement between the US, Russia, Iran, and several European countries. And so it really was multilateral. And one thing that was important about it, it was a moment when the US and Russia were on the same page and were working together to reach this agreement. So basically, it was an agreement that constrained Iran's nuclear program for about 15 years. And this was negotiated under the Obama administration. It was widely supported. And I think it was one of the high points of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, because it showed the ability of the regime, the multilateral regime, to constrain a potential nuclear weapon state with an agreement that seemed quite sophisticated. And among other things, the agreement involved a very intrusive inspection regime, the most intrusive inspection regime that we have for a security agreement. So it was path-breaking in many respects. And so when Trump came along in 2018 and withdrew the United States from the treaty, and it was because Trump doesn't have much regard for international law norms, and in addition, didn't want to support anything that was negotiated by Obama. He did it over the opposition of the entire rest of the world. And the consequences have been quite significant. So Iran tried to stay in the agreement for a while with the support of the Europeans, and eventually it gave up. And so the agreement is totally dead. And Iran has basically returned to pursuing the enrichment of uranium. And the IAEA has stated that Iran has enriched uranium to about 60% purity, and it needs 90% purity for weapons grade uranium. And it's not very far away in terms of the technical capabilities there. And so the IAEA has said that Iran has enriched enough uranium to near weapons grade to make, quote, several nuclear bombs. So what was an incredible success story of the non-proliferation regime was completely abandoned. And this is, I think, it's the fact that Iran, we don't know exactly what it's doing, but it doesn't look great. It's creating tensions in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia has announced that if Iran were ever to get a nuclear weapon, it would pursue nuclear weapons as well. Of course, it's driving a lot of the tensions currently in the Middle East war with Israel and Iran now, who've been engaged in a Cold War for quite a while now attacking each other, and Israel threatening to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. And so it's much, much worse. And so this is, a very, very unfortunate development. On the North Korean side, I mean, basically, six administrations failed to constrain North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And I think the Biden administration essentially gave up on it. And so we are in a world now of containment with respect to North Korea's arsenal. We are no longer in the world where we are going to get North Korea to disarm. I don't think that's at all likely. And of course, the fact that North Korea is continuing to build up its nuclear arsenal and to test various kinds of ballistic missiles poses an increasing threat to Japan and South Korea. And hence there is a lot more talk now on the peninsula about whether these countries should pursue their own nuclear weapons. And we can look at the shift in public opinion in those countries, and you see public support, for example, in South Korea for an independent nuclear arsenal going up to about 70% now, and that's a change from past years. So this all supports the overall story that Ankit was talking about with, there's a renewed salience of nuclear weapons and they are being re-legitimized. And, I think there's this states are hedging their bets with regard to whether they might want a nuclear program in the future.
So, Nina, I'm wondering if I could just ask you two follow-up questions. One on each of these programs. The first is on the Iran deal. So one of the ideas that's in circulation is that in entering into this deal with Iran, the effect of entering into this deal with Iran is that Iran was therefore empowered to expand its regional presence using weapons that were not nuclear, but that nevertheless expanded its reach in the region and therefore empowered it to act more aggressively toward its neighbors or within its neighbors' territories through non-state groups, so that at the point at which it ultimately might acquire nuclear weapons, it was in a stronger position. And that is often cited as a reason the nuclear deal was a mistake. So I'm just sort of like wondering what your take is on that. And then the second is on the story about the Korean Peninsula. One thing I've sometimes heard is actually the United States was extremely successful in its nuclear policy on the Korean Peninsula, because although it didn't actually prevent North Korea from developing a nuclear weapons program, it made it significantly harder and delayed by decades the development of that program. And so I guess I'm just wondering sort of how you would respond to each of them, because each of these stories, because they seem to be slightly different stories from the ones that you're telling, so that we can situate these two episodes within sort of like the broader patterns to which Ankit referred.
Mm-hmm. So those are good questions. So on Iran, I mean, Iran was supporting its regional proxies long before the JCPOA. And the single thing that boosted Iran as a regional power was the 2003 Iraq War, which decimated Iraq and left Iran standing as one of the major regional powers. The JCPOA wasn't even in operation that long. It was operated from 2015 to 2018. So Iran, Iran's position as a regional power had already been established, in its relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah were already in existence. And I don't think the JCPOA didn't make that much difference in that regard. But now it is, the fact that there is no JCPOA, there's no Iran deal, has basically eliminated all the inspections that would have helped to keep Iran in check. So now, and Iran has now kicked out the IAEA inspectors. So where once we had quite a good sense of what Iran was doing, and of course you never know whether they're hiding something, but we had a pretty good sense. Now we know nothing because they've destroyed the cameras and there are no inspectors. So we're in a much, much worse position than we were under the JCPOA. On North Korea, I mean, I'm quite critical of the policies toward North Korea. I think that when the Bush II administration came in, they basically undermined all the progress that the Clinton administration had made with North Korea. They basically, there was, the six-part agreement. The U.S. never upheld. I mean, both sides cheated on the agreement, but the West never really upheld its part of the agreement. The Bush administration came in, Bush II came in and kind of pulled the rug out from under it. And so we have insisted, the West has insisted on a fairly, stark terms. And when Trump administration came in, Secretary of State Pompeo said, he had his 12 demands, and these were unrealistic. So I don't see that diplomacy has been very positive with regard to North Korea. It has acquired a full-blown nuclear arsenal. UN security resolution sanctioning North Korea have had very little effect. It's been able to work around sanctions. It's paid no attention to the resolutions calling for it to halt its missile testing. So I see this largely as a failure, a major failure of both overall multilateral policy, but particularly U.S. sanctions policy. And if you look at the history of U.S. efforts, non-proliferation efforts, the United States has played a very crucial role in stemming proliferation through its bilateral policies and its sanctions policies. And this is one case where it just completely failed.
Okay, great. Thank you. And back to you then to ask the question about how the Iran case in particular, and maybe to use it as a case study for discussing the non-proliferation treaty. And I guess my more specific question is, one of the things that's sometimes said, I think, about the Iran case and other similar cases is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty essentially codified an unequal power relationship between the nuclear possessing states and the non-nuclear possessing states and weapons possessing states. And in failing to disarm, which was part of the tripartite agreement that you mentioned, and also limiting the ability of non-nuclear weapon states to use nuclear materials for energy as an energy source, the nuclear possessing states in some ways retracted from the grand bargain of the NPT. And so Iran's resistance to it was a reflection of that, and that absent some way to bring back all three pillars of the NPT, we were likely to see more of this going forward. And I guess I'm just wondering, since you yourself sort of highlighted these three pillars of the NPT, what you make of that story and how you put the effort to restrict the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran, North Korea, other sites in which we might be seeing an increase in proliferation into the non-proliferation structure, given that it was designed to be this tripartite system and has ultimately retracted a little bit, according to some, on two of those three pillars.
Thank you. There's a lot in that, and really important and interesting points. So I do think, if we think about the NPT and the idea of the grand bargain, with these three pillars coming into play, that for many states in the world, not just the Irans and North Koreas, but many other non-nuclear weapon states, and New Zealand being one, the lack of progress that has been made on the disarmament limb is very disillusioning. And I think that's partly down to, or in significant part down to, the politics of it all, and obviously nuclear weapon states not wanting to give up nuclear weapons, but it's partly actually, I think, the law has a role to play in what's going on here too, and why we're not seeing more progress. The way the treaty was drafted, many of the terms in the treaty are vague and ambiguous. So if we take the disarmament provision, which is in Article 6 of the NPT, I spoke about it before, it calls for the states parties to negotiate in good faith for effective measures on nuclear disarmament. That's vague language, and the vagueness has been used for the last 6 decades, really for states to take different views on this. So we did have the International Court of Justice in 1996 coming down and saying Article 6 doesn't just require negotiations, it requires states to actually also achieve nuclear disarmament. That has to happen. But the nuclear weapon states have never accepted that. And so a lot of the time when we get into the negotiating rooms for trying to move forward a disarmament agenda, the time is spent debating what the terms of Article 6 mean. What does it mean to have a negotiation? What do effective measures mean? What is an effective measure? What's not? Rather than actually progressing any tangible steps towards disarmament. And so I think that the vagueness and the lack of progress has had a whole array of different effects, partly playing into the stories of North Korea and Iran, but also it's part of the story as to why we have, on the other side, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a treaty that was briefly mentioned before, It was drafted in 2017, and it's states that really want to see a world without nuclear weapons who have broken away, and to set up this treaty that has very strong prohibitions on all manner of things in the nuclear realm, trying to find other sites because they see the NPT space as really gridlocked and not going far enough fast. So that's one element of what's going on that's making, I think, the NPT space is incredibly fraught. It's very difficult to get traction. There are other reasons for that too that we can dive into if that's helpful. It's the other thing on the non-proliferation front, and again, a different side to the discussion that we've been having, and I think discussion we've been having is very important, and I agree with what Ankit and Nina have said. But how we see what the problem is, a lot of the time at the moment, the discussions around picking out particular actors that are problematic, that are irresponsible, that need to be reined in. North Korea and Iran, obviously at the top of that list. And clearly they do pose threats and they're issues to be engaged with. So by no means want to suggest we shouldn't be going there. But I think what we have is when we start just thinking about nuclear issues in terms of who's irresponsible and can't handle nuclear weapons, the suggestion is that there are some states that are responsible and who can handle them, and we're securitizing actors rather than the weapons themselves. And I think that's starting to lose out on an important element of the conversation. We need, I think, to start getting traction, to start seeing nuclear weapons in and of themselves as problematic pieces of technology we need to deal with, not just particular actors who need to be reined in.
And is it the case, Anna, then, that during this period in the 90s that to which Ankit was referring, that there was a sense that the nuclear weapon possessing states were sufficiently responsible that focusing on non-proliferation made sense? Or is it your view that actually the efforts to make progress under the NPT regime were always sort of like hamstrung by the failure of these nuclear weapons possessing states to take seriously the prospect of disarmament and the inability to describe with more concrete detail what that would entail and what peaceful uses of energy might entail and so on and so forth. And so that the inability to work within the ambiguities, I guess, and to end up in sort of like paralysis as opposed to forward progress.
So I think, and there's no question in the 1990s we saw a significant drop in the number of nuclear weapons around the world. So there were tangible steps taken to start lowering the numbers. But in terms of putting the infrastructure in place to ensure that we're really on a trajectory to get to a world without nuclear weapons, that I think there were always difficulty and points of tension around that. So Ankit referred to before the 1995 NPT review conference. It was a very significant conference because at that point, written into the NPT was the fact that it could end at that point, it could be extended. There was an opportunity to get potentially make some changes for maybe some stronger wording around disarmament to come to the fore. And that didn't happen. Really, all the states in the end, there was some strong arming that went on, I understand, from the nuclear weapon states to get all the states on board to say, yes, we will just extend the treaty indefinitely as it is. And I think that was a real missed opportunity. I think there was a point at which we could have started to do things quite differently, and that didn't happen. And that has led to, we've now had as many NPT review conferences fail to reach any form of agreement as we've had agreements. And so some of the structure, well, we saw some weapons numbers coming down, the structural problems have been there all along.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Ankit, I think that's a nice transition point back to you. I want to ask you about these like structural problems. And first of all, like I'd be curious to know whether you agree with Anna about that pivotal moment in 1995, since you two are sort of in conversation on this point. And so it might be a good idea to just bring that conversation full circle. But also, since you mentioned the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, how do you think that fits into this landscape? And what do you think the prospects are for it going forward in light of some of the stressors that you mentioned earlier?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so just analytically, the point I would make, and this is not a normative view that I'm expressing at all. I mean, I think if no other year other than 1995 would the outcome that we got at the 1995 review conference have been possible, and I really do mean that because it was this really unique period. I mean, even the latter half of the 1990s, when you do get a sense that things with India, Pakistan, North Korea are starting to head in a different direction. 1995 is that perfect mid 1990s period of nuclear optimism. I mean, Anna, was absolutely right to bring up the fact that the nuclear weapon states did have a vested interest in indefinite extension. But of course, what indefinite extension does is that it actually removes the mechanism in many ways by which the non-nuclear weapon states had a degree of leverage over the major powers. Right? The NPT comes out of an understanding at the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that a world with fewer nuclear armed states is better for their own security. And so the powers are self-interested in the non-proliferation regime. It's not something that the United States and the Soviet Union do out of any highfalutin ideals about a world without nuclear weapons. It's a mechanism of security for these countries. And so in the 1990s, because they've implemented some of those steps that we both talked about, the rest of the world ultimately does conclude, perhaps begrudgingly under some degree of pressure, that indefinite extension will create a system by which this process of disarmament that did appear to be taking place, because numbers reductions were taking place, could potentially continue, and that the other nuclear possessors, which at the time were a small group of countries, very small group of countries, could potentially come along for the ride. And all of those assumptions, I think, in hindsight, have proven to be false. And I think that's where we get into the TPNW. I think the first thing I'll say about the TPNW and the big difference between the TPNW and the NPT is that the NPT categorically does not seek to delegitimize nuclear deterrence. So it does not contend with the question of whether or not nuclear weapons are a legitimate tool for states seeking national security. That is actually very important to the nuclear weapon states because they rely on nuclear deterrence. And so when, for instance, a month before the Ukraine war in 2022, you have the P5, the N5 under the NPT, the 5 nuclear weapons possessor states who detonated these weapons before 1967, agreeing that nuclear war cannot be cannot be won and must never be fought, that famous Reagan-Gorbachev formulation from the 1980s, that is immediately followed by a paragraph that includes many, I think 3 specific points about the benefits of nuclear deterrence for these countries. The TPNW explicitly takes the opposite position. It is philosophically much closer to the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. Those two deal with different weapons of mass destruction and are premised on the agreement that those weapons are so revulsive that they're simply impermissible for possession, for use in warfare. And the TPNW takes a similar approach to nuclear weapons. And that distinction, I think, is important because that's precisely the reason why no nuclear weapons possessor states or states that depend on extended deterrence have endorsed the TPNW. And by contrast, the states that have signed on to the TPNW largely have done so partly out of an expression of frustration, in my opinion, with the Article 6 progress within the NPT regime. The preamble of the TPNW alludes to the NPT and frames the treaty as essentially complementary to the NPT's objectives, but this view is just not shared by the NPT states. So I think in my introductory remarks, I actually referenced the TPNW as a stressor on the NPT regime, because ultimately I think that is the category into which I would put it, because of course it does ultimately challenge the status quo under which the nuclear weapon states and the extended deterrence beneficiaries of the United States in particular continue to view nuclear deterrence. And so you asked a bit about the future. I think this is a problem that's not going to go away. In fact, I would argue that viewed from the vantage point of 2024, the TPNW has been around for a few years now. We can no longer make the case that the TPNW is a unique stressor on the NPT, because I think generally we're seeing just the NPT come under strain from a number of sources now. And so the TPNW is potentially going to be a conduit for many of those frustrations that the states that ultimately, I think, feel very much like their agency in the broader non-proliferation regime has been taken away after indefinite extension and the steps taken by the weapon states. I think the TPNW will be a forum for those states to continue expressing those views.
Do you think,
Monica, could I just jump in on this
sure,
issue?
Sure, go
Both on what Anna said about sort of the 1995 period, and Ankit as well. So I just want to give a quick interpretation of, how the TPNW fits into legal development. So a key thing about the NPT is that the provisions on non-proliferation and the provisions on disarmament are unequally legalized. So the obligations under non-proliferation are highly legalized, right? There's a monitoring system, right? They're written into the treaty. They're legal obligations. Disarmament is not as highly legalized. So there's this huge asymmetry in the treaty about how legalized these pillars are. And in the 1995 period after that, the non-nuclear states tried to insert more obligations on the nuclear powers to pursue disarmament, time-bound disarmament, the 13 steps, right? All these conditions. And they were unsuccessful in the end. And so their goal was to try to, further legalize the under-legalized disarmament side of the NPT. When they failed, they went to pursue the TPNW. It's a legal treaty outside the regime. So they failed to legalize the disarmament pillar in the regime, and therefore they went outside the regime. I think it's for people interested in how the law works here, I think that's quite an important aspect of, when you ask, where did the TPNW come from?
Yeah, thank you so much for that intervention, Nina, because it's actually exactly what I was going to ask. Ankit, so I just pulled up the language of the NPT on disarmament, which says that each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. And as Nina was saying, there have then been efforts to try to make this obligation to pursue negotiations, which is not an obligation to achieve any particular result, a harder legal obligation, such that actually one needs to achieve disarmament, and then that leads to the treaty. And I guess my question is, does this suggest that actually the nuclear possessing states never really agreed to disarm? That the idea that disarmament was one of the main pillars of the NPT is sort of a nice piece of mythology that we use to try to talk about how the NPT was actually more egalitarian than it in fact was, but that at the time, and then again in 1995, disarmament was not taken to be an essential pillar of the regime in the same way that non-proliferation was, or do you read it differently? I'm trying to just get a sense of what you make of the way of this differential legalization point, to use Nina's language, in the context of the NPT.
So I would say here that, I think here we get to the limits of viewing states as unitary actors, because I do think the diplomats at the 1995 review conference that were charged with getting this outcome, I think generally viewed this objective of disarmament as instrumentally useful for the processes of a negotiation. And perhaps I think one of the difficulties with disarmament is we've long debated how you get there, what the process of disarmament looks like. So instrumentally and practically, I think the vagueness of the language, I think it's legitimate to view it as a cynical ploy by the nuclear weapon states, but equally so when you don't have a clear theory of what disarmament looks like, which I don't think anybody did in the 1990s, that generalized language, I think, starts to look just a lot more practical. There were also other issues, right? The French and the Chinese were late to join the NPT, and so the weapon states did need to actually take into account the completeness of addressing the concerns that those two particular possessors would bring into the regime. So that is an issue that I think often does get left out a little bit. And then the reason I sort of mentioned that the limitations of the unitary actor theory is because even today, those of us who work on the security side of this, it's quite worrying when you talk to potentially folks involved in military operations, military planning, nuclear planning, that are actually frankly surprised when they are reminded that the United States has made this commitment under Article 6 of the NPT to relinquish nuclear weapons, because of course these are the parts of the bureaucratic systems within the weapon states, and I don't think the US is unique in this regard, that ascribe tremendous instrumental utility to nuclear weapons. So this idea of disarmament, it is not one that deeply permeates the broader nuclear weapons establishment in these states. Which is, I think, essentially answering your question in the affirmative, right? That this was not something that deeply, I think, permeated and began to really inform the way in which the United States conceived of its own nuclear policy. And if you read the Nuclear Posture Reviews, which was first released in 1994 under the Clinton administration, and every successive administration has issued one, the disarmament goal is included, but it is absolutely peripheral to these documents that range into the 100+ page range in terms of all of the other issues they discuss pertaining to nuclear weapons.
Okay, and Anna, thank you, Ankit. And Anna, I want to ask you that same question before then Nina turning back to you and taking the conversation in a slightly different direction by thinking more prospectively. But Anna, first I'd like to ask you that question.
Thank you. So yes, and if we go right back to the drafting in the 60s of the NPT, I think it's no secret that the nuclear weapon states at the time were not particularly interested in disarmament. They did want non-proliferation, but other states at the table absolutely wanted disarmament in the mix and were very committed to getting it in there. They didn't get everything they wanted. They wanted a much stronger, and there were different ideas, but some of them wanted sort of a time limited, that disarmament would happen within a year or two, 5 years. You know, there were these ideas that it had to happen very quickly, and that didn't occur. But I do think it is seen by many states parties to the NPT as absolutely vital and crucial. And I take the point that I think in terms of how legalized it is, if we're using that language, completely accept that there are many, especially nuclear weapon states, that see it and use it, the language, to argue that it's not a particularly strong legal standard. It only requires negotiations and nothing more. A huge number of states, though, interpret it very differently. And I think the point I made before about the International Court of Justice saying it's not just about negotiations, it actually contains within it this requirement to reach a result and to achieve nuclear disarmament is a view agreed to by many states. So I think really where this gets us to is the fact that this division within the nuclear realm, with the nuclearism that nuclear weapon states and many of their allies adhere to, versus the anti-nuclear ideals of non-nuclear weapon states, are these two poles that really run through a large number of the laws in this space. And you can see how both sides try to use the law and what's there to get their agendas in there, and it leads to this stymieing where we're not getting fast.
Okay, great, thank you. And so, Nina, having covered now quite a bit of the history, not in chronological order, let's think a little bit more about where we're going. And we talked about some of the stressors in the current system, where we're going from here. And, you know, in the United States, we've just had a very significant election. And so I'm wondering how you see that affecting these trends that we've been describing more generally, and where you see us going from here, and what the problems are, as well as some of the prospects for mitigating those problems might be.
Right. Well, whatever you thought about the kind of depressing state of the nuclear world order before the American election, it's worse now. So Trump is back, and we don't know exactly what he's going to do in terms of US strategy and policy, but we do have some ideas from his first round of being president. And so we know that Trump doesn't care very much about international law and norms, and he doesn't care very much about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And he's on record as saying that Japan and South Korea should get nuclear weapons. He's very skeptical of alliances, and so he will want NATO countries to pay more of their defense spending, and maybe he would even wish to pull out of NATO. So huge uncertainty in terms of US relations with the countries that are currently under the US extended deterrence nuclear umbrella. And because historically the United States has played such an important role in preventing even its allies from acquiring nuclear weapons, if Trump pulls back the United States from its relationship with NATO and from its East Asian allies, that could spur much more interest in proliferation. And there'll be, I would say, Trump will probably engage in very tremendous defense spending on the nuclear arsenal. Biden had spent $70 billion. That's the 2025 budget, and Trump will probably increase that by quite a bit. I want to focus on one particular issue that I think it will be quite worrisome, and this is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that Anna spoke about. And this is a treaty that here I think the interaction of legal issues and political issues is really interesting, because this is, as Anna said, this is a widely adhered to treaty. There are 187 parties, but it's never come into force. But it nevertheless has created a norm, but against testing of any kind, but it has never come into force. And the United States is one of the countries that never ratified this treaty. And so we've had essentially a 30-year moratorium on testing, but this treaty is in a precarious position because it was never become legally binding. In November 2023, Russia, which had ratified the CTBT, the Test Ban Treaty, withdrew its ratification. And of course, there was lots of criticism of Russia for, going backward on its obligation. But in fact, as Russia pointed out, it was now in the same relationship to the treaty that the United States is, which is that it has signed but not ratified. Now Trump is coming in, and his former national security advisor has written an article in Foreign Affairs arguing that the United States should begin testing nuclear weapons again. And we have not done this since 1992. I think this would be a huge mistake. And if the United States begins to test nuclear weapons again, then very likely Russia and China will test. And then, of course, this opens the door to other countries who might seek nuclear weapons. The CTBT is a very important non-proliferation measure, and it's not coincidental that it was agreed to in 1996, at the same time that the NPT was extended in 1995. So if the Trump administration blows up this treaty, then it opens the door to other countries, who may have interested in pursuing nuclear weapons, and they will be able to test them, and that will be removing one important constraint on the ability to proliferate. So I think that's potentially quite an unfortunate development, and I hope that there's going to be a lot of political and diplomatic mobilization against that.
Thank you, Nina. And so I'll get back to you then to ask, are you also worried about that? I mean, one possibility might be, and is this a realistic possibility, that an effort, a suggestion of retreat from the testing treaty by the United States leads to many who are in favor of preserving something like a disarmament norm, or a non-proliferation norm, or an anti-testing norm, sort of rallying globally in favor of the non-use and testing of nuclear weapons? Or do you think, like in a sort of a similar way that we saw with Trump's effort to withdraw from Paris and say, like, let's scrap this and create something new, and the world said, no, we're actually sticking with Paris, that took a long time? Or do you think that in light of so many of the other stressors to which you referred, actually the reaction is very likely to be as Nina described, which is, no, US goes down this road, it's very likely that many, many others will follow? So I guess I want to ask if you agree with that assessment. And then the second question to ask you is, and I'm sort of cognizant of the time, just how you see like technological developments fitting into this landscape that we've been addressing. So like technology is just advancing at an exponential rate. And so how does that affect the nuclear non-proliferation, non-use, non-testing set of norms in particular?
I agree with Nina that a world in which the United States even hints at returning to testing is going to be bad. Let me provide two rather prosaic reasons why, one prosaic, one perhaps less prosaic reason why the United States might still not end up going down that route. And I fully agree that the probability of testing has gone up after this election. So the first of these is that our nuclear test site in Nevada happens to be near one of the fastest growing American cities in the last 30 years, Las Vegas. So the domestic politics of nuclear testing in the United States are I think, far from resolved. And nuclear detonations in Nevada would certainly, I think, draw quite a bit of a strong political reaction compared to what Las Vegas looked like, at least in the early 90s. The second reason is technical. And I think here we get back to national self-interest when it comes to how countries think about these things. The US has the most to lose. We've carried out more than 1,000 nuclear tests, which gives us quite a bit of data. The Chinese have done 46. And right now, one of the big questions, I think, vexing even the Trump administration's likely appointees is going to be the expansion of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. And so doing anything to accelerate that threat, especially at a time when US technical experts at the national labs basically basically say that there's no technical reason for the United States to need to test, would be a very self-defeating thing to do, although I don't put that obviously off the table for that particular reason, right? Let me also just say before we move on, you know, I think we haven't mentioned perhaps the most important norm of all in this world of nuclear weapons, which is the norm of non-use. And I also generally worry about this in terms of the propensity of loose talk around nuclear weapons around the world. And I won't go into a long list of citations of the world leaders that have talked about nuclear weapons in loose ways, but Vladimir Putin, I think, comes to mind most of all these days, but Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, previous US presidents, Narendra Modi, Pakistani leaders in recent years as well. I think this is just generally concerning because nuclear threat making is on the rise, and I think that's really underpinned by a generally growing instrumental view about the utility of nuclear weapons in warfare. And so that needs to be, I think, very much front and center in the global conversation around nuclear norms. On technology, very briefly, I will say we have numerous sources of technological flux that I think are affecting both the ways in which military organizations are thinking about the nuclear balance, but these also do raise certain legal questions, not necessarily directly for the NPT regime per se, but some of these have manifested. For instance, at the last NPT review conference, the US, UK, and France issued a unilateral assurance, which was actually the first time the US did this. This was before the Biden administration's nuclear posture review even released, that they will maintain human decision-making on all potential decisions to use nuclear weapons, right? And so that addresses, I think, some of the growing anxieties around the ways in which artificial intelligence becoming fused with nuclear decision-making systems or command and control systems could start to manifest new risks. In the realm of international humanitarian law, there are similar questions about the permissibility of targeting certain objects in space, for instance, that might be implicated in dual use kind of nuclear and civilian or military and civilian roles. Some of these discussions, I think, do get rather technical and arcane, but I think this speaks to a growing sense of anxiety that managing the threats to nuclear stability that stem from this technological flux will also require a consideration of new legal and normative questions. And of course, there's quite a strong case to be made that limiting this conversation to nuclear weapons alone is insufficient because many of these new technologies also cut into conventional warfare in particular.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Well, as you can see from like my lighting situation, I'm now like all of a sudden standing in the dark, which indicates that we are close to the end of the hour. But Anna, I want to just ask you one final question, which is, do you see prospects for international lawyers who are interested in preserving these norms on non-use, non-testing, non-proliferation avenues available to sort of to work to keep them in place, given all of these headwinds that we're confronting, and even my efforts to try to find a silver lining? It turns out Ankit said, no, that's a lead lining. It's not going to work.
It is very, very difficult right now, I think, to see, definitely to see how we move forward. And we're now not even talking about moving forward, we're talking about how we hold the line. I was interested in your comment, though, a little bit earlier where you talked about, you know, maybe if the testing starts and all this happens, that actually that will force more movement in the space to come together. There may be something to that. As we know, international lawyers love a crisis. And I think one of the things that's lacking in this space is actually not necessarily the lawyers in the room or the policy analysts or security analysts. It's actually the broader public engagement with the issues. I think it's very hard to get traction and move forward without significant engagement from civil society and other social movements. And we had that during the Cold War. We had huge anti-nuclear movements. We had that even into the 90s to a certain degree, but that's really fallen away. So while I'm by no means hoping to bring on nuclear testing, I am absolutely strongly against it. if that is where we start to go, it may be that that starts to mobilize the public more broadly, and that could in a way start to help shift things as well. So hard to know. It's, I think, looking pretty bleak at this stage, but got to find the shoots of how we might be able to move forward.
Okay, well, thank you all for this really instructive conversation. I benefited enormously from it, learned from all of you, and I'm sure that our viewers, both who are here live and who will be watching after the fact, will as well. And Jen, I'll just hand it back over to you. Thank you to CUP for hosting it. And I think that might be it, unless you have some final words that you want to offer.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and let people know that we'll be sharing a recording of this conversation within the next week. Full archives of AJIL and AJIL Unbound can be found on the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/AJIL. And thanks again to the panelists and the audience for your time.